Hey everyone, welcome back to On Purpose, the #1 health podcast in the world. Thanks to each and every one of you that come back every week to become healthier, happier, and more healed. Now, you know that I'm a curious person who wants to learn more and more about our mind, our body, our health, and tools and techniques that can improve that for us. And I like sitting down with individuals who've dedicated their lives and their life's work to understanding what can improve the lives of others. Today's guest is someone I've been really looking forward to having on the show. I know you'll be really excited as well. We're going to be talking about a wide array of subjects, but I'm going to give you really practical, insightful tips and tools that you can put into your life and day immediately to make an impact. My guest today is Dr. Andrew Weil, a world-renowned leader and pioneer in the field of integrative medicine. Combining a Harvard education and a lifetime of practicing natural and preventive medicine, Dr. Weil is the founder and director of the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine at the University of Arizona, where he is a clinical professor of medicine and professor of public health. A New York Times best-selling author, Dr. Weil is the author of 15 books on health and well-being. Dr. Weil is also the founder and partner in the growing family of True Food Kitchen restaurants. Dr. Weil's current projects include matcha.com, bringing the world's best matcha to the West. I am so excited to welcome Dr. Andrew Weil. Andrew, thank you for being here.
I'm delighted to be here.
Very excited to learn from you about a subject matter that has so much, as we were talking about briefly before, has no insight, bad insight. I feel people are underserved in this space. And so let's dive straight in. The first thing I wanted to ask you and dive into you with was this thought around what are the diet and lifestyle habits people need to do every day to live longer, healthier, and prevent cognitive decline?
Well, that's fairly simple. The first rule of healthy eating is to avoid refined, processed, and manufactured food. That's what's doing us in. And I'm one of the first people to have begun talking about the importance of containing inappropriate inflammation. And I have developed an anti-inflammatory diet based on the Mediterranean diet, but I added Asian influences to that because I've spent a lot of time in Asia, and there are things there like mushrooms and turmeric and tea that I find very useful. But it really there's more and more evidence that chronic low-level inappropriate inflammation is the root cause of most of the serious diseases that do people in prematurely. So containing inflammation is very important, and diet has a major influence there. But again, the first step of an anti-inflammatory diet is to try to eliminate refined, processed, and manufactured foods. In terms of other lifestyle practices, basic ones: maintain physical activity throughout life, get good rest and sleep, learn and practice some methods of neutralizing the harmful effects of stress on the mind and the body, maintaining good relationships, especially spending time with people in whose company you feel more positive. Those are very simple steps. As for cognitive decline, this is of great concern to many people, because we all know people who have experienced cognitive decline, and we want to avoid that. So I think two very practical pieces of advice. One is don't get hit in the head. And that may mean, taking precautions if you're doing hazardous activities and being, I don't recommend that people play American football, for example. And another is don't smoke because nicotine constricts blood vessels, reduces blood flow to the brain. So those are two simple steps. I think also I recommend practices like doing word puzzles to keep your mind active, learning another language. You don't have to master the language, just the attempt to learn it is very useful. So those are some pieces of practical information.
Yeah, I think you've given us a beautiful spectrum of things to focus on there. And I think I definitely in my life try and tackle one of those areas every year.
Good.
Because I feel that they're so big in and of themselves. And my biggest mistake in the past was when I tried to change everything
right.
all at the same time. Yeah. You're trying to improve your relationship, you're trying to improve your gut, you're trying to improve your workout regime. And so I love what you're saying, that there's all these things, and I would list everyone who's listening and watching, please try to choose one thing that you're going to try to deeply improve this year that you feel is the one you're struggling with the most, that may be having the most negative impact on you, because you'll start to see how they all affect each other.
Yeah, you don't have to wait a year, however. I have a book called 8 Weeks to Optimum Health, which is a program each week. You do something, like you start by walking 10 minutes a day, and each week you add 5 minutes to that.
There we go.
But I think you're quite right that a big mistake that people make is to try to do global change and then they give up. So I think it's best to take it in small bites.
Yeah, let's dive into some of those, because I think they're easier said than done. So what you just spoke about with diet, that's something that I've genuinely been focusing on probably for the past 12 months in terms of not eating any packaged foods and refined sugars and processed foods, and so I'm eating only natural foods. I'm already plant-based in my diet, but making sure that I'm eating vegetables and trying to avoid anything that's out of a packet. It's easier said than done. It took a lot of time for me to kind of move in that direction. I had to find a meal prep service. I have an amazing wife who's an incredible cook and chef, and so that helps a million times over. For people that are trying to make simple steps to changing specifically their diet to an anti-inflammatory diet, what are certain simple steps people can take? The 8-week version almost.
Well, in the book I said learn how to be friendly with broccoli. Broccoli is a very easy vegetable to cook, but many people overcook it, and it's not very appetizing. And there's a very simple way of cooking it for about 2 minutes. So it's bright green and crunchy. Put some olive oil on it, garlic if you want. But that's a wonderful powerhouse vegetable with cancer protective effects. Add some berries to your diet because they're full of antioxidants. I mentioned tea. I think tea is a very healthful beverage. It's one of the main sources of protective antioxidants. I think it's good to learn different types of tea and how to add them, find which ones you like.
What specific teas have you found to have those benefits?
Well, I'm a big fan of green tea because I've spent a lot of time in Japan, and particularly matcha green tea, which I think is, has the highest levels of some of these protective elements in them. But I think all tea is beneficial. When I was doing research on healthy aging, I made a number of trips to Okinawa, which at the time that I was doing it had the highest concentration of centenarians in the world. And one of the things that I observed there was that in very hot weather, people were drinking cold, unsweetened turmeric tea. Delicious. And, in North America, people are really unfamiliar with turmeric except as it occurs in yellow mustard and curry. But this form of turmeric in Okinawa is fermented, and which makes it more bioavailable and tastier. It dissolves very quickly in cold water. It's really delicious. So that's one that I recommend, learning how to get more turmeric into your diet. It's the most powerful anti-inflammatory agent, natural anti-inflammatory agent that we know.
Wow. Yeah, turmeric's a big part of the Indian diet. So
Indians
I was exposed to it since I was a kid.
Indians eat it at every meal.
Yes. Yeah.
And, one of the interesting correlations, India, I think rural India especially, has the lowest rate of Alzheimer's disease in the world. And many researchers think that's related to the regular consumption of turmeric because Alzheimer's begins as inflammation in the brain. And there's some animal research showing that turmeric can protect rats that are genetically programmed to develop Alzheimer's from developing it. So I think turmeric is a very good thing to become friendly with.
That's a great insight. I love that story of going to Okinawa. I went to Sardinia a few years ago.
Well, that's one of the healthy
Correct,
Asian
yeah, one
places.
of the blue zones.
Yeah, and what's interesting, I want to hear what you saw there, but if you go to these areas around the world where there are unusual concentrations of very healthy old people, women outnumber men by a long shot. When you get up in the ranges of upper 90s, hundreds, it's almost all women. Sardinia is the one exception. That their men and women are equally in those ranks of the oldest old, and we don't know why.
Yeah. I was really fascinated to see the few things, and it's all on the spectrum of things you mentioned. But what was really interesting is that their workouts were natural. Of course, they were farming, they were walking, they were taking care of the land.
Same in Okinawa. They were hauling fishing nets and gardening. I saw I think 102-year-old woman who was hoeing the garden in front of her house. So they're not going to gyms. They're not working with trainers. Yes. It's just daily activity.
Yeah. And then the other thing was that they were eating foods only in season. So everything was picked locally. Everything was locally grown or locally found. And they weren't eating things that were just artificially available.
And what about social connectedness?
I mean, that was a big part of it. I mean, people were living in bigger families or living closer by to families with children. So children weren't just being raised by 2 people, but by 10 people. And every evening and even during the middle of the day, they would get together. And
I think that's very important. The MacArthur Foundation some years ago did a study of successful aging. They identified a population of people they considered successful agers, and then they looked to see what were the outstanding commonalities. And the 2 that stood out, and this dwarfed everything else, whether they took supplements, whether they, dietary patterns, the 2 were maintenance of physical activity throughout life and maintenance of social and intellectual connectedness.
I want to dive into 2 things that you mentioned earlier, and I want to dive into them deeply because I think, again, they're buzzwords. People know about them, but I'd like people to really understand the benefits. So let's talk about matcha, because that's your favorite daily plant.
Yeah.
And ally, which you say has this incredible mind-body benefit.
Yes.
I think it has already seeped its way into mainstream
Yeah,
culture.
quite amazing.
But yeah.
I went to Japan when I was 17 and lived with families. One family outside of Tokyo. And this was 1959. Japan was a very different place. And the second night that I was there, my host mother, we had no language in common, took me next door to her neighbor who practiced tea ceremony. So the 3 of us sat around and the neighbor did a tea ceremony and presented me with a bowl of matcha. And 2 things about it totally caught my attention. One was the color, this vibrant green, and the other was the bamboo whisk that you use to whisk the matcha tea into a froth in a bowl of water. It's carved from a single piece of bamboo, just a miracle of Japanese craftsmanship. So I fell in love with matcha. When I got back to the States, nobody knew anything about it or ever heard of it. Over the years, when I would go to Japan, I'd bring matcha back and I'd turn people onto it. I tried, starting in the 1980s, I partnered with a Japanese company to try to sell it on my website. There was no market for it. I did that again in the 1990s. Anyway, it's quite amazing now to see this, penetrating our culture. Matcha is prepared in a very unique way. The tea plants are heavily shaded for 3 weeks before harvest. A 90% shade cloth, so it cuts out almost all sunlight. In response to that, the leaves get bigger and thinner and produce more chlorophyll, trying to take advantage of what light is there. And they also produce more antioxidants and flavor compounds and this amino acid L-theanine that has a calming effect and moderates the action of caffeine. So for that reason, matcha, I think, is more healthful than other forms of tea. And also you consume the whole leaf. Not just an infusion of it. So that's one that I'm quite enthusiastic about. And I started a company. We got the URL matcha.com, which was a great tool.
Yeah. When did you get that URL? I'm fascinated. Did you have to buy it recently, or you've had it for years?
No, it's like 6 or 7 years. We tracked it down. It was owned by a Japanese man who had no idea what he had. If you went to the site, he had pictures of his cats. And my business partner, Andre Fasciola, managed to negotiate with him, and we got it at a quite reasonable price. People in Japan can't believe we've got that. Anyway, we import very high quality matcha. And by the way, if your listeners use a discount code J, we'll give them a very generous discount on our products.
That. There you go. Okay. There you go. Everyone.
So I'm a big fan of matcha. I'm delighted to see that gaining traction. However, a lot of the matcha here is not very good because it's such a fine powder that unless it's carefully protected, it oxidizes very quickly, loses its brilliant green color, becomes bitter. And many people have tried matcha and say, they don't like it, but they've never tasted good matcha. So as I said, I think a lot of research has been done on green tea in particular, but all tea has beneficial effects. And frankly, I don't want to bash coffee, but I would love to see more of a tea culture develop here.
Me too. I'm a big tea fan.
Good.
Yeah.
I know. So coffee, the stimulant effects of coffee and tea are very different. Coffee is much more jangling. It is much more associated with truly addictive behavior. There's a real crash coming down from coffee. You don't see any of that with tea. And some of it is because of this modifying effect of L-theanine. But also, I find it interesting that historically and culturally, the associations with coffee was always associated with kind of argumentative behavior, loud, raucous gatherings of people, political activism, whereas tea, the historical associations are much more with contemplation, meditation. I think it would be very beneficial to see a greater tea culture develop in North America, that could work its way into some of the coffee culture that's now so dominant.
Yeah, when me and my wife launched our tea company, we said we wanted to make tea as hot as coffee. That was the goal, because we grew up with tea culture, both from our British and Indian heritage.
Sure.
Yeah, I found it so therapeutic. I like you, love the color, love the scent, love the experience of having to drink it slow. You don't really have tea on the go.
Exactly.
There's a meditative process with it and a healing property to it.
And it's a big change. When I was growing up, tea was what old people and sick people drank in this country. And it's wonderful to see that change now.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other one that I wanted to ask you about was the green Mediterranean diet.
Yes, this is interesting. It's just recently been in the news. We have so much scientific evidence for the benefits of the Mediterranean diet in terms of longevity, overall lowest risks of disease. And I think most of your listeners are familiar with the Mediterranean diet. It's heavily on fruits and vegetables and whole grains. Olive oil is the main cooking fat, meat used very occasionally, oily fish, relatively low in sugar, so forth. So recently, a green Mediterranean diet has been proposed as being even healthier. And this reduces animal products even further, increases fruits and vegetables, especially sources of a class of compounds called polyphenols. And these are antioxidant compounds that are found in plants and fruits, vegetables, especially berries, tea, and dark chocolate. So this green Mediterranean diet specifically recommended green tea to add, and they noted chocolate, but they mentioned all tea. So I think this is fascinating, to see. And these are researchers really, not really trying to promote any agenda.
Yeah. Has your work led to any of the research that I'm recently seeing around like canola oil, palm oil, and the negative harmful effects versus what now I'm only eating in is avocado oil and olive oil.
Yep.
As my primary
There's one
oil.
other that you should check out is algae oil, if you don't know about that.
I didn't. Yeah, no.
This is a new product that's out there, and it's made through culture. It's called cultured oil, and it's microorganisms that have been altered to produce oil, which is almost all monounsaturated fat, has a very high smoke point, neutral taste, and also has one of the omega-3 fatty acids in it. So that's another choice. But those are the ones I use also, avocado and olive.
And what are some of the harmful effects of the canola, palm oil? Because they're pretty much, literally, if you turn any packet around, everything is canola oil, palm oil, and there's
palm
one more,
oil, aside from all the environmental effects, which are terrible, there are two kinds of palm oils. There's an oil extracted from the fruit of the oil palm, which is red and is used in Africa as a cooking oil and is okay, but we rarely see that. And then there's the oil extracted from the kernel, and that is very high in unstable, unsaturated fatty acids that oxidize quickly. It's also very high in saturated fat. So that's not a good one. Canola oil is the word means Canadian oil, and it was developed by Canadian scientists, I think in the 1920s or 1930s, from a traditional cooking oil that in India, rapeseed oil.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's another one. Yeah.
And rape has a toxic fatty acid in it, possibly. The Canadian scientists worked with it to develop one that was low in that fatty acid. Problems with canola oil, although the fatty acid profile is okay, most of the commercially produced canola oil is heavily contaminated with agrochemicals, and it's extracted with heat and solvents, and that denatures the oil and creates carcinogenic products. So it's one I would stay away from now. I recommended it in the past, but I don't anymore. Yeah. I'm a big fan of olive oil.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. No, everyone cook with olive oil.
By the way, I've taught. I've worked with a number of Indian patients, who are very convinced that ghee can do no harm. And it's pure butter fat, and it's probably not healthy, and the rates of cardiovascular disease in India are pretty high. And I've taught people to use ghee as a flavoring, cook with a healthier oil like avocado, and then at the end you can drizzle some ghee over to get the flavor you want. And I've also suggested, I had a student, a physician from Kerala, where coconut, it's the land of coconuts, and they use coconut oil and full-fat coconut milk. And I taught her to use cashew milk, which is very easy to make and is much healthier fat than coconut. It's monounsaturated, not saturated, and the taste is delicious.
Wow, that's good to know about ghee, because it's one of those things that my mom never wants me to miss.
Right, I know.
But then I always hear this in between. But I like the
use it as a flavoring at the end.
Yeah. I like the happy medium, the happy balance. That makes it. She'll be happy to hear about the turmeric.
Good.
That's and saffron's the other one. She's never telling me to miss.
And that's a good one.
Yeah.
But the turmeric, our company also sells that fermented turmeric from Okinawa, and we'll send you some to try.
Please, I'd love
delicious.
That sounds
really
amazing.
Really good.
It's fascinating. You mentioned earlier limiting the smoking of cigarettes and the negative effects of nicotine. What about when it comes to marijuana? I think that, marijuana is such an interesting topic for so many people today. There are so many perspectives. Most of them out there are positive, but I'd love to know from your perspective, how are you seeing marijuana affect the brain? How are you seeing marijuana affect the actual
First of all, I'm going to call it cannabis, because the word marijuana has negative connotations. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about cannabis.
Yes, sure.
So I did the first controlled human experiments with cannabis in 1964.
Wow.
It was the first time anyone had given that to human subjects in a controlled fashion to see what it did. So it's a plant that I've been involved with for some time. And let me say, this is also a plant very well known in India. It's, native to Asia. The word, the main species, Cannabis sativa. The sativa means useful. And cannabis is hemp. It's the same root as canvas, because canvas used to be made from hemp fiber. But this is a very useful plant. It provides an edible seed, an edible oil, a fiber, a medicine, and an intoxicant. That's a lot of ways for one plant, to serve us. And it really only wants to serve us. And I think we have really not been wise in the way we've dealt with that plant. So in terms of the intoxicating properties of cannabis, it's a difficult subject to talk about, because the chemistry of that plant is so complex. There's so many different strains, and there's so much variation in individual reaction to it. There are people who can smoke cannabis before bed and have a great night's sleep. Other people smoke it before bed and they can't sleep the entire night. So there's that kind of disparity in reactions to it. First of all, that it is one of the least toxic drugs that we know. You can't kill people with it. And you can't say that about any drug that we use in medicine. And every drug has a lethal dose. And in some cases, the lethal dose is relatively close to the useful dose. You can't calculate a lethal dose for cannabis. So on a physical level, it's extremely safe. I mean, there's concerns about smoking it and whether that's how harmful that may be for lungs. That goes back and forth. I don't think it's a great idea to smoke anything. And inhale smoke into the lungs. Probably not a good idea.
Okay.
But certainly not as toxic as tobacco, and it doesn't have anything in it as addictive as nicotine, which is one of the most addictive drugs that we know. I think the medical usefulness of cannabis, there's a lot of potential there. I think this is a subject that's open at the moment. There's a lot of research on ways it can reduce muscle spasticity. It can help people with, all sorts of neuromuscular problems, with digestive problems. But again, a lot of individual reaction to it. We're seeing this plant, being made available to people. And I think it's about time that it gets out of that restrictive drug schedule and made available for therapeutic use. I was just talking yesterday, our center does a podcast, and I was interviewing a nurse who is a member of the American Cannabis Nurses Association. I didn't know there was such a thing. But there is a large group of nurses who have now become trained in using cannabis therapeutically.
In what form, yeah?
They use all different forms, and they base that on the individual patient. But I think they're in a much better position to do this than physicians, because there's no cannabis preparation out there that most doctors are going to feel comfortable using. And until we have something like that, I don't think doctors are going to go near it. They don't understand it. But it's great that nurses are using it. A lot of them are using it for pain control. They're also using it in hospice situations, especially with people with terminal cancer, and they say they find it very useful. So I think it's, I'm happy to see this becoming used. I think there's a lot we don't know about it, and I find it very difficult when people ask my advice about it. I don't know what preparations to recommend to people. That it's confusing.
What's your take on the more social use of it?
Well, I was part of that culture in my 20s and 30s. And it was fun back then. It was a fun social experience. And then I also found that it was very stimulated my imagination, creativity, helped me write. But at some point that changed, and my reactions to it changed. I became more introspective, withdrawn, and then eventually it became an unproductive habit that just made me groggy. And it was hard for me to separate myself from it. And
so what was that? Yeah, what do you think that was? Because I think that's such a interesting arc of a journey with it.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people feel that way. That's kind of like an arc. I had a lot of friends who initially started for those reasons and then ended up paranoid or ended up confused or ended up lethargic. Or
I don't know. Maybe maybe it has something to do with changes as we age. Possible. But it was such a striking change in the effects for me. So something that I thought of as an ally that was helping me, really, it ceased being that.
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting to know, because I feel I had a lot of friends in the same bucket. I never really dabbled with it deeply, but in my brief experiences, it was very brief experiences. It was far more the creative or the spark, but I never got deep into it, but my friends who did, they went on the same arc.
So that's interesting. And I don't know, I have not seen anyone write about that or talk about that or investigate what the cause of that is.
Yeah.
Also, today, the preparations of cannabis that are out there are much, much stronger than those that were available when I was using it way back.
You mean the ones that are available from a leisure perspective? Or
from everywhere. Well, I'll tell you a story. A physician colleague of mine in San Francisco sent me 3 preparations of cannabis that had come from a medical dispensary, and he wanted me to try them. And I was, I'm a little leery about that since I'm, haven't used it in so long. One of them was a kind of oil that was in a tube, a little syringe, and it came with a very professionally printed brochure. And it was recommending it for pain control especially. And it said to start with an amount the size of a grain of rice and work up from there. So I took a piece half the size of a grain of rice, and my friend had said, take it at bedtime. I took it at bedtime, went to sleep, woke up about an hour later in full-blown delirium with hallucinations as vivid as those I've had from using LSD. I couldn't move. I had no equilibrium, had burning thirst. I couldn't reach for a glass of water. I couldn't call for help. And it kept coming on stronger and stronger. And I had no idea when this was going to end. And I had to use all the tricks that I've learned in meditation and breath control to keep myself centered. And when it finally subsided about 8 hours later, my equilibrium was off for 2 days. I had very bad balance. And I was really angry. And this brochure said work up from there. And I'm thinking there are people out there, taking this. That was like a very, very powerful thing, and I thought fairly dangerous.
What brought you into this so early on? Because we're at a point in culture, I feel, where these things are now coming to the forefront. Of course, I'm probably sure you're seeing cycles of that. You probably saw it come.
Well, I was, I'm just starting work on a book about psychedelics, and a lot of it I'm telling my own history because I knew everyone involved in all of that. But my interest goes back to about, I think it was a specific day in 1960, right before I went to Harvard, and there was an article in the newspaper in Philadelphia about supposedly the death of a student at a California university who was taking mescaline for inspiration for a creative writing course, and it said mescaline was a vision-inducing drug. I'd never heard of it. And they made the mistake of quoting from his last paper, and I just remember this phrase, galaxies of exploding colors. When I read that, I knew I wanted mescaline. So I inquired about it. I came across Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception, which had been written a few years before. And when I got to Harvard, I had the very good fortune to become associated with Richard Evans Schultes, who was the director of the Harvard Botanical Museum. And he had been one of the great explorers of the Amazon and discovered a lot of hallucinogenic plants down there. So he really, through him, I became very interested in psychedelic plants. At the same time, Richard Alpert and Timothy Leary were just starting their work with psilocybin at Harvard. These drugs were not controlled substances then. I was able to obtain mescaline from a chemical company. I took it a number of times, had interesting experience, but I was very disappointed I didn't have vision. I didn't see galaxies of exploding colors. Yeah. I was very disappointed. Anyway, so that was before I'd ever tried cannabis. But as a result of being in that place at that time, I really got to meet and come across all of the people who worked in that field, with Albert Hofmann, who was the discoverer of LSD, Gordon Wasson, who rediscovered the mushroom cults in Mexico, Sasha Shulgin, who invented many of the designer drugs. So I had a long period of experimentation with psychedelics, and I, have had a lot of benefit from them. I really don't use them anymore. My first book, The Natural Mind, which was about the importance of altered states of consciousness.
Oh, no, you can carry on. Making sure they see it. Yeah, making sure they see it.
But Alan Watts wrote a blurb for it, in which he said, when you get the message, you hang up the telephone. And so I think I got what I had to learn from psychedelics, and I didn't feel the need to continue to use them. But I've learned a lot of things from them, and a lot of that has formed my philosophy of integrative medicine, especially the very subtle, complex interactions of mind and body. Mm-hmm. And I have seen very powerfully that you can change external reality by changing internal reality.
Let's dive into psychedelics, because that was also what really intrigued me and drew me to your work, because again, I feel like my generation, generations after me, they're starting to hear these terms in mainstream culture a lot more often. And I feel like my role is to try and find the deepest experts in this space to help everyone have as much information they can have in order to make better decisions for themselves, their friends, their family, and anyone that's there. And so I'm going to ask questions that may seem really simple and basic, but by design, because I want people. So what are psychedelics for someone who keeps hearing that term from their friends and they keep nodding along, pretending to know what that is? What does it mean, and what comes under that umbrella?
The word, it was a coined word.